that is so exciting.
Yay.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And again, thank you so much for being here on a Saturday to partake in this conversation and listen to this conversation. As I was telling Sabrina earlier, this is just me following my curiosity and wanting to have these conversations with people I enjoy talking to, and then opening up the space so that anyone else who wants to hear what I have to think about or the questions I have to ask can also be a part of it as well. So thank you. I'm going to say thank you profusely throughout this because I'm just so grateful to have you all here. And I am incredibly grateful to have Sabrina here to, I feel like going with like the psychology terms, you're like my little guinea pig today, where I'm like, let's pick the brain and see what comes out and where we can go. So I do have a list of questions, but we will go with the flow. And I honestly think that we will not get through all the questions that I have, which is more than okay. So I trust in the flow and the timing of this conversation. I will be as intentional and as mindful as possible of the time. And know that, again, this is just me following my curiosity. And I hope this conversation sparks a bit of curiosity for you, and that then you go and have conversations with other people about. So like a ripple, we're here, I'm just dropping one little pebble in the river or the lake or whatever the case is, and hopefully it ripples out. So I will get started by asking Sabrina, probably the biggest, most important question is, who are you?
Oh my, where to begin? So first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me. It makes me feel very important that Stephanie asked me to do this with her. Stephanie, I've only known for a couple of years through our connection with Team Sugar Runs, but I feel like it's been a lot longer than that just because of how well we've gotten along and just of how much I've learned from her already in this short time. You really caused me to pause and be more mindful about a lot of things when I see your posts and when I connect with you. So thank you on a personal level for that. And then just thank you to all you provide to all of our followers and definitely our teammates too. So who am I? Okay, well, I'm currently a psychology teacher at a high school just outside of Chicago. I have been teaching for about 17 years. And I've taught a myriad of classes in that time, but the main class I've taught is the AP Psychology course. And connected to that, I have also been a runner for a very long time. And in the last couple of years have just gotten curious about the connection between those two things. So I want to do a quick shout out, like a Sean out. That's a new term I just made up. A shout out to our friend Sean King, who is here with us, who has been providing me some space and opportunity to talk about those two things connected to each other. And I know that that's something Stephanie and I have talked about. So that's where that connection comes from also. My running journey, I guess, is also relevant here. I've been running for almost 20 years, I would say officially. I ran in high school a little bit, like I was on the track team for 1 year, but not in a very serious manner. I just was happy to be on it and join. And then when I got to college, I started running just more for exercise. And I was doing an internship at the time in my sophomore year, junior year, somewhere around there. And I was doing an internship. I went to Northwestern University. I was taking the train down into the city to go to this internship. And I just happened to see an advertisement for the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. They were starting their training program for the Chicago Marathon for later that year. And I was looking at it and I'm like, why would I ever possibly run a marathon? Like, what would be the point? I was not running more than probably like 5Ks. Maybe there was like a 10K in there. But honestly, I hadn't been running more than that. And I looked at it, and my dad is also a runner. So I called him from the train. I was like, I'm looking at this thing right now. Like, do you have any interest in it? And he's like, nah, no, not really. I'm like, okay, hung up, whatever. About an hour later, my dad calls me back. He's like, let's do it. So he had obviously given it some thought. Something sparked him as well. So we signed up. We were in different training groups, but we both did the program. So within that, we also raised money for the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. And that was in 2003. Since then, I've run 8 marathons. I'll be running my 9th this fall, do Chicago again. And then hopefully next March, I will finally get to my 6th world marathon major. I only have one left to get all those 6 stars, and it's Tokyo. So I was supposed to do that in 2020. And then of course the pandemic happened. So I'm just a longtime runner. I think it's been good for me in many different ways, especially mentally and emotionally. Also community-wise, in the last year, I've started a run walk club outside of Chicago and Skokie called the Skokie Swifters, many of whom are here today. Thanks for joining us. And that has been incredibly fulfilling for me, not just in terms of the exercise aspect and the weekly accountability, but more so in the community and the friendships that have been built through that as well. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I think that kind of covers a little bit of everything in a nutshell about me.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
I realize I have a tendency to talk a lot. So I'm like, wait, I didn't even introduce myself because I gave such a long introduction. And I want to make sure that I'm so aware of the space that I'm taking up to make sure that I'm giving you and everyone else here enough space as well. But similarly, I started running in 2012. And for me, it was like, oh, I had just had a baby 6 months prior. And I thought, this is something I can do with my kids. I can pop them in a stroller and easily head out the door. And I joined a running group, and that's really what did it for me in terms of doing races. And I was laughing at Terrence when he's like, running my first half tomorrow, because at the point, by the time I had run my first half, I was already signed up for 2 other ones because I loved the training and being with everyone so much that it was just a lot of fun. And part of that running journey, or the beginning of my running journey, was social media and sharing a lot of what I did on social media, because that, to your point of accountability, I had accountability with my run group, but then there was also accountability with, the unknowns of social media, which at that point was just my family members, that we're talking about 10 years ago with social media. So the question, or in my sharing that, the question now that I have for you is, how did you make that transition to social media? As someone who's been running for 20 years, social media and Instagram, and I always focus on Instagram because my brain can only handle one social media platform at a time. So I always talk about Instagram. I'm like, Facebook, I don't know, Twitter, I don't know, any of those other platforms, I don't know. So I'm curious as to how you navigated sharing your running journey, because I'm the cookie runner. You're run teacher, right? Like there's run in our names. Like that's something that it's a really big part of our identity, but then it's also a big part of who we are in that social media landscape. So I'm curious to hear from you. When did you start using social media? What was your initial relationship with social media? And have you noticed any themes that have been with you since you've been on social media? And just like I asked, who are you as a runner? I guess, who are you as a person with a social media profile that is also a runner?
My gosh. Okay. There's a lot in there. So I think, one of the first things that came to my mind as you were talking about that, and I don't know if this should be a point of pride or a point of shame, but I always like to say I'm like first generation Facebook, because I was in college when it first came out, it was purely for college students. And so it became a way to connect, with people on your campus, because for a time it was very limited just to your specific university. So I would say Facebook is really like the first entry into social media, unless you want to define things like AOL Messenger as social media also, like back in the day, where you would have your little like profile and you'd put like some profound quote there, and like it was supposed to make everybody think you were like really sad or whatever. So like there's all these sorts of iterations of what social media has been defined as, I think. But anyway, so I think, starting with Facebook, I guess, is just sort of where it began for me, but it wasn't really so much focused on running. It was more just being as a person, right? As a college student trying to connect with people. I would say that when I first got started on Instagram, it was more just about me on a personal level. And I do think part of the name that I came up with was from more of a teaching aspect at the time, because I think that's maybe where I identified with more. But I would say really the thing that sort of kind of triggered me to make it more focused on the running was, I think, the World Marathon Majors journey that I've been on. That really helped expand, first of all, my knowledge of running, the community, and of the history of running too. But then it also helped me to see the wider community that I have immediate access to, right? So you have all these elite runners and these professionals who are on Instagram. And yes, of course, they can be very inspiring and you can take a lot from them. But it also gave me access to the people that are immediately connected to me or in my circle and could give me a little bit more personalized encouragement and community than some of these elite runners. I like to think of it also as sort of my personal journal. Like, I know people have varying levels of comfort with what they share and stuff. And for me, it's a lot about trying to express what I'm feeling about a particular moment of a run, or about a run in general, about a race, or about, the Swifters. Sometimes like I post about that too, and just my journey with how that came to be. But I think for me, it's a way to express that and to hopefully find some sort of connection to other people with that. And hopefully that those people can find something out of there that they can use too. I know you have some other questions that are going to address this later, but just to kind of give a preview, I think looking at it on like the positive or negative side, right? Like, obviously we can talk about a lot of the negative aspects of social media too, but at least for me within the running, I want that to be not just positive for me and to help me parse through what I'm thinking, but also positive for other people to walk away with something too, maybe. And I'd like to think that that's what we're providing on our own personal pages, but also, for example, we have a Swifter Facebook, we have a Swifter Instagram, and my hope is that people are seeing those posts and they want to get inspired to not just join us, but just to go out and do their own thing. And along the way, figure out, what's important to them with their own running too. I feel like I missed a question or two in there. Did I hit a couple of things?
I think you answered. I don't even know. I feel like usually when I ask a question, it's never a simple question. It's always a very multifaceted
Complex
question.
Yes.
So I appreciate that. And I think this will connect to something. Well, we're just going to talk about it now.
Sure.
Because I love what you said, how your intention is inspiration. So when I hear you talk about that, I understand, or what I'm getting is that there is a lot of clarity as to your why with social media, right? Because there's different ways. It's like you either engage with social media as the person who's consuming content, or you engage with social media as the person who's putting out content. And here I'm like, wait, okay, I want this conversation to be about the consumption piece, but obviously it's all connected. And I often come back to, in all of my teachings and in everything that I always, whether it's this exploration of the runner identity, whether it's this exploration of, for me, like the yoga teacher identity or the yoga practitioner identity, a lot of it always comes down to the why. Why am I doing what I'm doing? And in that why, it's how do I come back to myself and not necessarily do what others are doing, because that's what I think. So I love that your intention is just clear, where it's like, it's inspiration, and hopefully it's an inspiration that's rooted in your reality and in the truth of your experience. And I guess the question now that I want to ask with that is, how do we navigate social media when not all accounts are like that? And I know that's a massive question, because not all accounts. And even yesterday, I was having a conversation the day before, with some friends too, where it's like, we have social media and it's all wonderful. And there is a lot of good, there is a lot of not so good. And then there's a lot of in between that you really don't know, right? Like that you're, at least for me, where there's certain accounts where I'm like, I don't know why I'm feeling this way. Like what's going on? Like what insecurity is this tapping into in me? Like what's happening within me that I'm responding to an account a certain way. But the question is that it's, you are putting out information, putting out content that is inspirational. And I'm just curious if there's any tip or any suggestion you have in terms of maybe recognizing which accounts are not doing that.
So I want to acknowledge that you said that's a hard question to answer, or it's a hard thing to figure out because there is so much bad, or for lack of a more sophisticated word, right? There's just, social media obviously means different things to different people. And I think, so in as much as like what I'm putting out there is I'm hoping it's inspirational to somebody else, I'm also doing it, I'm going to say selfishly, although I don't think it really is, but selfishly it's for me too, right? Like I'm putting it out there so that I can get my own thoughts out. And when I am able to maybe reread that over the next couple of days after I put it out there, like that helps me to remember why I'm doing something, or if a run went terribly, I'm able to talk through that. And hopefully that helps me to process it more too. So it is, in as much as it's for other people, I hope it's for other people. It's really for me as well. But I think that's where I think I try to make sure that I'm like following the same people, or like connecting with those that I know are going to give me something in return, whether they read my stuff or not. I can get something positive from them, or I can get something good from them, or I can get a question that maybe I've never thought about pertaining to my own running in some way that I should be asking myself. So it's easier said than done to just like ignore the bad stuff. But I think what becomes hard is, another layer of this is thinking of your own mindset when you're looking at that stuff too. And this is actually something that we've talked about on this podcast I do called The Reset with the For the Run crew and Sean. I think we have to remember where we are currently when we're reading those things, or where is my mood, where is my mindset when I'm looking at something. If I'm already sad or upset about the way that a race went or something, and I'm reading somebody else's post who like did fantastic and they got a PR and they did all these wonderful things, and I'm reading that, like it's very possible that that's going to make me feel even worse about myself. And again, I want to acknowledge that those things aren't easy, right? We have to be able to be aware of how we're feeling about that first before we can act on it. But I think it is important to recognize the mood you're in when you're doing those things. If you're really, really happy, then everything's going to seem great and roses and rainbows and puppies and kittens and everything. But there's a difference with how you are presenting in that moment to how you're analyzing things, or how you're accepting or not accepting what's coming at you as well.
I love that. And I'm like, oh, so if you see me looking away, it's because I'm taking notes.
That's okay.
I'm a note taker. And I'm like, oh, there's number one. That's the number one takeaway from today. It's in terms of social media, it's understand your mood when you log in, right? And like, how are you feeling? And I really appreciate that, because you're absolutely right. When you are in a good mood, things kind of roll off you. And I feel like particularly as runners, and I've never done another sport besides like soccer in middle school. So I can't say if this is a universal saying, but there's definitely a deep tenderness that comes with running and our running performance, and how that performance connects to our worth as runners. So if you're logging on, and I feel like I see it all the time, right? When I'm like, oh, someone got a PR, cool, like that rolls off. But if I'm coming off of a bad run, or I'm coming off of a race that did not go as expected, and then I check out other people's posts, that is going to like trigger something in me. And that's what, I've experienced that at races. I experienced that very briefly after the Chicago Marathon last year, where I had a great training cycle, and I'm like, cool. I think this is going to be a good year for a solid run. At this point, I'm like, my relationship to PRs is just weird. I don't know if I want to work for them. I don't know if I want to work on them. I don't know what I want to do. But at last year's Chicago race, I'm like, okay, I think this is going to be a good race. And then I woke up on race morning and my brain was like, I think it's not. Like, I think you're just going to show up. You're just going to show up and do what you can. And during that race, it was that mindset of, okay, let me just have the most fun that I can have while I'm running from start to finish. Let me have as much fun as I can. But then there was that moment afterwards of checking social media and of being like, oh, so did anybody else have a race experience like I did? Like there was almost this need to validate my experience based on what other people experienced. Even though when I finished, I was really proud of myself, but there was something about like, I want to know who struggled as well. And then I want to know who did better. And then there's that question of these people who did better. Why did they do better? Why couldn't I have done better? Or, but it took, so it's like, I think that's like that takeaway number 2 here. It's that also checking in with yourself afterwards, after being on social media and being like, wait, how am I feeling? Mm-hmm. And thankfully for me, I spend so much time in my head and I do so much thinking and I talk to so many people. And I think that's a big part of it too. It's making sure that your support system, and I've been thinking about this a lot, particularly with social media, of our support systems and the support systems that exist off of social media. Obviously people on social media contribute to that, but I have this whole idea of like, we need outside perspective and different perspectives when it comes to our social support networks, where you need other people who are runners that get what it's like to be a runner. And then you need those people who are not connected to the sport at all, who just, they love you and they support your love of the sport, but they really don't get why you love the sport as much as you do. Mm-hmm. And so I think of, I forget what my point was, because I was just like, yes, what you're saying is so on point, but it's also that, that awareness of how are you feeling when you're going into your social media time, and then checking in with yourself as to how are you feeling afterwards. And then hopefully
can I throw in a point that I was thinking about while you were talking, when you mentioned the so like after your race, like you adjusted, right? Like you made a decision to have different goals that day, which I think all of us should, well, I'll speak for myself. I should work on doing more of that, more of the adjustment, right? Like you come up to race week and I might have this particular goal, and then I wake up in the morning and I start in the race or whatever, and it just doesn't feel right. I'm the type of person that will still try to just go for that same goal, even though I probably should be adjusting it just based on how things were. And so I think on a personal level, that leads me at the end of a race to feel even more disappointed than if I had just gone ahead and taken that time to adjust. Connecting that to what you've been saying and just back to the social media piece, I think that personally is really hard for me sometimes, because if I come off of a bad race, or which it wasn't bad, right? It was just, I'm assessing it as bad, even though I finished, I probably did fine. It was just in that moment, it felt bad. And for example, if I log on to our Team Sugar Runs account and I see that everybody's posts are up there about, I dropped a PR today and I did this and I did this, and it's hard. And I think if I had adjusted my goal to begin with, or adjusted my thought process to begin with at the beginning of that race, then later when I go and I share my post or I look at other people's, then I won't feel as bad, right? Like it's almost like you have to do the work ahead of time in order for your engagement with other people's accounts and other people's posts to be better later. And that's a hard, I think, forethought process to go through, because you can only control so much in that moment and we can only let go of so much. And if we're not trying to do that ahead of time, obviously it's going to be harder, but how hard is it to just do that ahead of time too? It's like this weird back and forth that we just sometimes have to come to accept. And I think it also, at least for me, it kind of makes me rethink what I might do at the next race. And it makes me also remember, like, you felt this way before and everything turned out fine. So why are you worried this time? But that's hard. That's really hard. So a lot of what you were saying made me think about that aspect of like, can we do the work ahead of time so that later everything is okay?
And I think that's the $1 million question.
Yeah, for sure.
Go get yourself a lab and start researching that.
Oh,
Because
I
that
do
is
have
a
the
really
psych
important.
background.
Yeah, you do.
I just
Because I
need some
think
guinea pigs.
that is a really big question. And as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about, I don't know if there's a better word for it, but kind of like this running elevator where we think we're always supposed to be going up, 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 whether it's PRs, breaking PRs, meeting new mileage, like that. And the reality is that running is, there's peaks, there's valleys, and there is, I feel like in my personal experience, I spend like 50% of my time in a plateau. Like, I'm just like, what's going on here? Like, come on. I'm giving you it all. Can you just give me like a morsel, like just a drop? And I think that's part of, again, like this struggle, particularly for me. So I always like to tell this story because I think it's just so pivotal in my particular running journey. And I realized that there's like a piece of the story that I haven't told. And the piece of the story is that I lived in Boston for 4 years. Okay. Boston Marathon. Everybody knows about the Boston Marathon, or, once you start dipping your toes into running, you become aware of the Boston Marathon. And when we lived in Boston, I did not run. Like, I ran, if I went to the gym and was like, let me get a 30-minute workout, let me hop on the treadmill. Did not run while I lived in Boston. Every year, though, we would go out and we would spectate at the race. And we're talking about, this was maybe 2002 to 2006. I don't know. Anyways, it was early 2000s that we lived there. And I just remember going out to the race, thinking that it was so amazing. These people were out there running, loving the crowds that were supporting them, but never giving it much more thought. Then a few years later, I myself start running. So we're talking about like almost a decade after having lived in Boston. I myself start to run. And like I started to share my running journey on Instagram. And in sharing that, like what you mentioned, it connected me to the wider running community, but then also to a local Miami base. At that point, we were back in Miami running community. And all of a sudden, I felt like everyone was working on the Boston Marathon or working on getting a time for that race. And I was like, I obviously have to do it too, right? Like, if everybody's working on it, like that's the running elevator. That's got to be the next step. And in that, I ran a lot of races. I've done a few marathons, done an ultra marathon just because I wanted to see if I could do it. I was like, oh, that's just who I was as a runner in the beginning, was founded on a lot of curiosity. I just wanted to see what I could do. But as my engagement in this online running community grew, much to what you shared, so did my awareness of what running looked like. And it just seemed like everyone was working on this one goal, or it seemed like all the big accounts on social media were the accounts that were getting to Boston, or are those accounts that have really fast running times. And that's what I thought I wanted too. And I'll never forget, I was like, oh, I'm going to train for another marathon. I had a horrible, probably the worst marathon experience you could ever envision for yourself. That's what I had in 2017 at the Chicago Marathon. And after that
was the hot year.
Yeah, I was so broken. I was like broken and heartbroken, which is a real tough combination. Yeah. And that's why I say that us runners are so tender when it comes to our running performance and how we view ourselves as runners. So that year I was very broken. And I believe it was like the year after, or maybe 2 years after that, I remember talking to my running coach and I was like, I really want to do this. I want, like, this is the time. And she stopped in our conversation and she's like, why? Like, basically her question was, do you actually want this for you? Or do you want this because that's what everyone else is doing? Mm-hmm. And that just stopped me dead in my tracks, because the minute she asked me that, whatever weight I was carrying, this weight of expectation that that was the next step, or this weight of expectation that that's what meant I was a runner, it completely lifted. And it gave me the permission to, I think, be more of who I knew I was. But because I was so involved in this online running community, and again, it's like no shade to the online running community. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad, but to what you're speaking to, it's that awareness of who you are, what's your headspace, even before, like we're talking about step one is recognizing who you are before you even log in, right?
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
step one here. Step two is, okay, now that I'm here, what's my mood? And then step three is kind of like, okay, so what's my mood afterwards? We're talking about levels and levels and levels of awareness here.
Yeah.
That most of us, at least I can say that for me, when I log onto social media, sometimes it's really mindfulness. Like it's not mindfulness, it's mindless. Like I'm just like, oh, I got like 5 minutes to just like eat crap. Let me log on. So I share that story because that for me was my experience of social media being this place where I could share, but then social media also being this place that instead of, in a way, yes, it expanded my vision, but also it contracted my vision, in which I thought that was the goal that everyone had to chase. And I saw this also recently where someone was like, hey, remember that not everyone runs marathons. Like people who run marathons, it's like 1% of the population. And yet there are days when I get on social media and I'm like, wait, everyone's running a marathon. Should I? Even though I know I don't like to run marathons, but I'm like, but everyone's running it. So shouldn't I? But it takes that minute to be like, hey, remember, this isn't the world. This isn't this. Yes, there is reality here, but this isn't the all-encompassing reality of what it means to be a runner. Like I didn't even realize there were, and it sounds so silly, but it's like, I didn't even realize there was runners who didn't race. Because again, my vision was everyone's running something. Everyone's training for something. And now I'm like, oh no, there are people who actually just run to run. Like they enjoy running and they don't care. So it's so interesting to think of, for me, like this running elevator and how I was on it, and how even now I have to check myself constantly when I go on, where it's like, okay, remember, and this is why I go back to what I initially said about you. It's like, oh, your why is to inspire. And for me, I'm like, okay, as a runner, what's my why? And can I remember what my why for running is, so that when I do see these messages or when I do follow these accounts, I am able to have a bit of separation between myself and that person's experience, like that detachment of, that detachment of experience.
Yeah. And it's not easy. I mean, I think this is something that comes up a lot when I think we talk about these different aspects, is that if we're talking about it in this context like we are now, I think some might rightly think like, oh, wow, well, it's so easy for them to do that. Like I can, I struggle with that. Like, no, it's not. It's really a struggle for me personally to remember those types of things, that I have to keep myself in check, like, as you said, and I have to remember to check my mood. And, these are things that I think if we do often enough will become more second nature. But for those of us who maybe haven't thought about that or haven't been as self-aware in the past, like that's something that has to be a conscious decision. Like when you're looking at this stuff, you have to think to yourself, like, this is not my experience. This is their experience, and everybody's different. And I will say too, I think that in many ways, at least with regards to Boston, I think social media has in general gotten a lot better with that. And I do see a lot of those posts, obviously right around March, April, we're going to see a ton of Boston related stuff. And I think that the way that Instagram has developed in terms of the running community, it's expanded beyond that. And there are so many more spaces, as you're saying, you didn't realize like people could run and not race, right? But there is that community also. There's more 5K community. There's people who do run streak challenge communities, right? There's all these little subgroups within the running community that have expanded. And I think because of social media, something I'm thinking of related to Boston, which is always a semi-embarrassing story for me, depending on who I'm talking to, depending on how much knowledge they have, is that I ran Boston for a charity in 2008. So I'm very fortunate. I got to have that experience. I will probably be 67 years old when I can finally qualify based on my times. So that's okay. I've done it. I got there. I have the medal. It's hanging right here, actually. So I'm good. And that, of course, the charity running is a whole nother discussion. But just to the point of when I ran it in 2008, I was still sort of a newbie runner. I mean, I had been running for about 5 years at that point, but I didn't know a lot about just the larger community. So I didn't know the Sitgo sign. I didn't know the history of Catherine Switzer, like Bobby Gibbs. Like I didn't know the history of all of that went along with it. And it was, it's a little embarrassing to say that now, just based on how much I do know. But I think those are access points that maybe we don't talk about often enough that could make Boston seem more realistic or not seem like such a high goal. Obviously, to qualify, those people should feel honored. They should feel deservedly so for their hard work. But there is another section of us who can still get there in various ways. And you should also be credited for that and realize that that's also an acceptable way to do that. And I think I'm partially saying that because I'm sort of thinking about a time, I don't see this as much anymore, when you would see comments from people, things like, well, what's the point of running a marathon if you can't do it in 3 hours? And why should you, who runs a 4.5-hour marathon, get to run Boston where everybody else had to qualify for it? And, obviously, like, those people are dumb and they shouldn't say those things, but on a deeper level, like, if there is a subgroup that I think feels that way, right? This more elitist mindset of not just Boston, but just like running in general. And I guess my hope is that people like you and me, and definitely Team Sugar Runs as a whole, and I think I can speak for a lot of the Swifters with this, just people like us, I see us as like combating that sort of, right? Running can be more than just blank, whatever someone says it is. And that's why I think it is so great as a sport, because you can find your subgroup within it. And you can find people's goals who match up with yours and groups who match up with what you want to do. And it doesn't just have to be one thing. And I do think in the grand scheme of things, overall, social media has helped develop that. Not always positive, but it has.
Yeah. And it's interesting to hear you say that, because I remember, and I think this is like when I fell in love with you, was in Chicago last year when we were all having coffee and you're like, yeah, I ran Boston, but for charity. Like, you had to like clarify that.
Right.
And I remember telling you, are you kidding me? Like, that I think is harder. And again, not to put anybody's work down if you qualify. Like, I think that's fabulous. It is a lot of work, but I know how much those fundraising minimums are for like Chicago or London or any of the, no, Chicago's actually like a lower one. Chicago's like easier with fun. Anyways.
Yeah.
Not going to talk about the charity, but I remember how you said it. And it was like an asterisk to this incredible experience. And I was like, no, you stop. You do not say you ran Boston. That's it. And I think that was from my own journey and from, my Jessica, hi, from her asking me that question of, do I want it because of me or do I want it because that's what everyone else? Because then what that prompted for me was, if I really want this particular experience, I will do what it takes to have it, especially when there's multiple ways in to having that experience. And what I realized then was, I don't want to fundraise to run that particular race. I would rather fundraise for something smaller and more local than to do that. But that was a layer to that of, okay, do I really want to do this race? The answer was no. And so I think Boston is always I feel bad for Boston because I'm like, that's the one that everyone like, that's the one that you can kind of pick on because there is this elitist mindset to it that some people do have. And that brings me to the following question for you in terms of, as people who are trying to combat that, how do we make the running community feel more inclusive, right? Because you can get that comment of, why are you running it if it's going to take you 4.5 hours? And that can severely discourage you from even trying, right? Or that can just embolden you to be like, you know what, I'm not here for you, I'm here for me. It can kind of go either way. So I'm curious, in terms of social media, in terms of comments like that, because even though it's gotten better, there are still comments like that, right? Like, there are still people thinking that way. And there are still people who, again, whether they're intentional with it or not, maybe the messaging on their post, or maybe the messaging in how, not even the messaging, because right now I'm into like storytelling. What we're doing when we're online, we're telling stories and we're telling a bit of our story. So I think there's also, you know, there may be some accounts that when they're telling their story of the Boston Marathon, they're telling it in a way that is making it feel like such an elite race, like is making it feel like this is not an experience that is for all, when the reality is that it is for all. So my question for you is, in that, as two people and as, you know, in community with other people who probably have social media accounts, or who have, you know, their own little soapbox with people to listen and support, what can we do to create more inclusivity, or to break down, and I feel like breakdown seems like a harsh word, but to really like break down the pedestal that we hold certain race experiences on?
I think my immediate response to that is creating those spaces intentionally for anybody, right? To feel like they are part of that community. Those spaces, I'm talking about in real life spaces, obviously also virtual spaces with it being social media, but I know I talk about them a lot, but that's just because I love them. But the Swifters, right? Like that was one of my main goals with creating this club. It's not a running club. It's a run walk club. And I think that piece alone has made it so much more accessible for some people. Literally just in a word, just in an advertisement. I mean, we've got people in our group who are thinking of running their first 5K later this summer. And they've never done more than not even a mile, right? Like they've been maybe walking, maybe they haven't, but they are literally planning to get started with this very first step. And that's not to say that the goal should be to run a race, or it should be to run whatever distance. It's just to say that this particular club has offered them an access point for making them feel like they belong more than they did before. We have some people who were maybe running for a long time and then they didn't, and they're now coming back to it. And the messaging in that for me is so important. I've had people ask, well, you know, how fast do you guys go? I'm like, well, every pace imaginable. I mean, out of all the people, if you come on a weekly basis, there's going to be at least one person, whether you're walking or running or jogging or doing whatever, you're going to find at least one person that matches you. And that is an important piece of making that community expansive enough so that there are different levels of people to get involved with. So at least in terms of real life, that has been very fulfilling for me to see that, to see people who never saw themselves as a runner now suddenly see themselves as a runner. But I think that carries over into social media too, right? Our Instagram account and our Facebook groups for the Swifters, I need to also feel like that's the messaging we're having there. You know, we don't necessarily have people who are posting about their paces, which is fine and great. And obviously there's a time and a place for that. And if they wanted to, they could, but the vibe is more, you're doing this thing, like, yay, you, right? Like, you got out there and you chose to do this. Doesn't matter how fast you did it. It doesn't matter what place you came in. And we celebrate those things too, right? Like, you can do both of those. And I think that we're finding a good space to do both of those things. That's what I want. That's my goal for them. And, on another level with that, I hope that that carries over for many of our Swifters. They have their own personal accounts too for social media. And I hope that carries over into that as well. How do they process, and are they feeling good about themselves, and can they put that out there? And, not every day is going to be great, and not every day is going to be good, but it has to make those spaces, it has to start somewhere. And if you can be the person to provide that space, whether that's through your personal account or a group that you're part of, to, I think, always remember that inclusive aspect, right? I don't ever want anybody to feel like they're not part of it. And so that means that you have to be purposeful and intentional about expanding what you post, expanding what you talk about, to make sure that everybody can feel included. And again, not everybody's going to connect to every single thing you put out there, but you should be putting a wide variety of stuff out there enough that everybody can connect to at least one thing that you put out there. That was a really wordy way of saying, like, be inclusive, but I hope that made sense.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing from you, and I think this is part of the shift that I've undergone, and I think this is maybe the trend that I'm starting to see within the running community,
Mm-hmm.
is that it's not either or, it's more of a both and. So it's not either pace or fun, it's both. And it's more. So here, when you're talking about this purposeful and intentional messaging, and it goes back to that first community discussion that we had, where ultimately what we were talking about was this need to expand how we see ourselves as runners, this need to expand how we define ourselves as runners. And that's what I'm hearing here, that it's really, it all comes down to an expansion of how you perceive yourself as a runner. And then also, I think of it too, in terms of what you said, it's like, let's cast a wide net. Mm-hmm. Let's cast as wide of a net as possible so that people can understand that there is something here for them. And I love that, because I always say that in here, where I live in Miami, sometimes it feels like it can be very niche, or it can be very like, which is the run walk club, which is the one for the fast runners, and it's like, oh, but how can, and as someone who has been running for as long as she has, and it's amazing how there's still spaces where I feel uncomfortable going to, because I feel like I'm too slow, or not fast enough, or like I can't keep up, or like I'm too fast, and it's amazing, again, for me as someone who has been running for so long, that even I can feel that way. So I'm always asking, so how can I be more inclusive in my messaging? And I also love that what I'm hearing from you and everything that you've said, it's kind of like, it starts at the micro level with what we post, with what we share, and then it gets bigger, and then it gets bigger. Because even here, it's like, okay, they can share their pace. We'll encourage you to share whatever, but know that the messaging is like, you're more than just that. It's that, it's that both and. All of this is important. Both your pace is important, and having fun is important, and just that you're showing up is important. So that to me is the trend that I feel like I'm seeing more. And as you were speaking earlier, I was thinking of like Runner's World magazine and Women's Running, and like those big publications, like seeing how it has changed
so much
over the pandemic. And I would say the pandemic is really what prompted them. And then there was also, like, I don't know if you heard the whole I think it was last year, the Keeping Track podcast, when they did the whole study on who's on the cover of these magazines. And that highlighted one part of what's going on with these magazine covers, but it's also been so neat to see how it's changed, and how they had oh God, I can't remember who it was, but it was a recent Runner's World. And it was like this guy who his club is, it's like the slow runners. I can't remember. I'm like, I'm picturing the magazine in my mind. It's outside this door. But I'm like, that's the first time you've ever seen that. And as soon as I saw him on the cover, I went and I found him on social media. I'm like, this is what I need to see.
Yeah.
I need to see that there are other runners. I need to see that there are people who are focused on having fun while doing this thing that is incredibly hard. Because the minute I get caught up in pace, to me, there's a, what is it, like a negative correlation between the two? Am I using like the
very good. Oh,
psychology
A+. A+.
I'm like, because I see that when I focus so much on pace, my joy and love of the sport goes down.
Oh, yes. And I wanted to provide sort of a real life situation. Not that we're not talking about real life, but just a thing that actually happened in regards to this idea of feeling like somebody doesn't belong. When we started the Swifters, we might have been in existence for a couple of months at that point. But we had one of our Swifters, she had a conversation with me one day about how she had never felt so accepted by a running group. And she spoke specifically about a different group in our area that she had tried to be a member of, and that she had tried to go to some of their meetups, and she always was left behind. She's more a walker than a runner. And although she has run races and things, and she always had felt a little left behind. She spoke about how sometimes in training in the summertime, she would get to a water station and it would be packed up already. And she never felt like she could be a runner because of that. That was her sort of first experience in getting into the running community. And so she admitted, I was a little hesitant to come out to your club for a while. I heard about you, but didn't come out for a while because she was worried about that, right? That had been her entry point. Imagine if her entry point had been on the complete opposite of that. Maybe she wouldn't necessarily still be running races or whatever. Like it just would have been completely different, likely, right? The positivity that she could have had versus the negativity that she did have. So fortunately, she found us. She's loving it. She's doing an awesome job. She's great. She's one of our greatest members. But I think that sort of exemplifies this idea of needing to expand that space for people. Not everybody has to become a runner and has to be part of the community, but it should be wide enough that anybody who wants to should not feel detracted at all from coming into it. And it's so great that things like Runner World have changed and there's these different communities now. And we just need more of that. And I think we have it, and it continues to grow. But it needs to be accessible for anyone. It really does.
Yeah. And as I'm listening to you, one, if that person watches this recording, major shout out to you for trying, because again, you could have had that one experience and thought running isn't for me, right? Like you could have had that experience and been like, I guess this isn't for me, because if this is what, it's easy to like say this running community, this particular running space is symbolic of all the other running spaces. So shout out to that person for showing up somewhere differently. And it's interesting because again, I'm coming back to the conversation last month where we talked about the importance of running community in how that shapes our identities as runners, and how being involved in the running community is part of what helps us fall in love with the sport. And I believe it was Deborah who talked about how it's not just your running, but it's your involvement in the sport. It's your volunteering at races. It's your supporting people. It's all those. It's when you're the cheerleader to the runners, that's another part of this runner identity. So I love that you shared that, because again, like that's been my experience too. And that's why, for the most part, I consider myself a solo runner. I'll run on Saturdays with like a group of my girlfriends, but for the most part, I feel like a solo runner because I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready to be vulnerable enough to run with other people, because there is a vulnerability that comes up with that. Just like there is even for me as well, where there's like a vulnerability sometimes with what I share on Instagram. And like, there are those moments where I have to remind myself, like, you share what feels good for you because it feels good to share it. Don't share if you're worried what other people are going to think. Those people, they're not paying your bills. They're not going to like, they're not laying their head down at night and having trouble falling asleep because they're thinking about you and you're running. But that's like part of it too, right? Like, again, it's like, I always come back to this detachment. Like, how can I detach myself personally from others' expectations, or from what I perceive will be others' expectations when I share parts of my running journey? And I just love that, because it's what are we doing outside of social media, and then what are we doing within social media, and what communities are we creating, and then what communities are we partaking in, what communities are we inviting people to be a part of. And I think it's so great, the whole run walk methodology, because it really is all inclusive. But I did have this question, and I feel like this is me playing devil's advocate with both of us, right? Like me playing devil's advocate with both of us, because what if there's someone that's like, no, our group is for fast runners. Like, that's what we want. That is our niche. Just like you have your slow runners, we want our fast runners. So what's your response to that? Or not even a response, but like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I'm like, wait, we need to be devil's advocate here too, because as people who are part of this running community and who have such a love for the sport, we want to make space for everyone, right? Like, we want to make space for everyone. I'm just curious as to, if someone were to tell you, nope, sorry, like, you have to be able to run, like, your easy pace has to be a 9-minute mile, and that's just it.
Cool, bro. Like, no, but like, yeah, great, good, that's fine. My caveat to that is, you can have that. You absolutely can have it, and that exists, right? There's I'm blanking on the name right now. It's called like Second City Runners or something, I think, based in Chicago. And actually a couple of our Swifters are part of it. You have to have a certain time qualifier to be part of their club. And they, they register on the racing circuit, and like they go around to different races, and great. And the caveat is, you can have that, and don't bring on the negativity to others that don't want that or might not fit that profile. And what I mean by that is going back to that runner with the elitist mindset who says, well, what's the point of running a marathon if you can't run it in less than 3 hours, or less than three and a half hours? As long as that fast group is not having that kind of mindset, and is also understanding that other people don't all have the same goals, I think that's great. I'm not here to say that every group has to be accepting of everybody. You can have whatever qualifications you want to have for certain groups. I just think you still need to be supportive of those other groups too, right? That's where the key comes in. And otherwise, I think that's okay. I would love to say that 9 minutes is my easy pace, and, like, but it's not. And that's also okay, right? My easy pace is 10. Some days it's 11, whatever. Like, I'm also getting to a point in my own personal running where I'm starting to let go of those numbers a little bit. And I say that to say just that it's okay to do that also. And it's okay to have numbers as your driving force, like that. Again, going back to, it should be for everybody. And if you want to have specific groups for specific things, it's okay, but just don't bring on any sort of negativity to the groups that don't necessarily have that same goal.
I love that, because what I'm hearing, or what I'm thinking now, my brain is like, oh, can we maybe put like together some information to hand out to all run clubs? Because I think and this is like an issue that I've had again here in my little microcosm of Miami, where there are times where I'm like, so what are the running groups that we have here? And I feel like that's part of it too. It's like, and it's so interesting for me as I ponder this and as I'm trying to think my way through what I'm trying to say, where it's like, in hearing what you're saying, it's almost like, wouldn't it be great if all these run clubs were somehow connected and could basically, hey, here's a new person. Sure, for today, come run with us. We may not be the group for you, but we think you should go check out that group, or that group. And I'm like, why doesn't something like that exist? Like here, I'm thinking about it now. I'm like, wouldn't that be great? Like, I don't know. And the second part that I'm thinking to that is like, even when you're going to this new run club, and I think that maybe an unspoken word of this is like, okay, so a new person shows up and maybe they're slower than someone else, and it seems like this is what you're doing with Skokie, right? Where it's like, there's always going to be someone that can at least be with you that first time. So I think about it that like as another thing that run clubs could do. It's like, maybe this isn't the run club for you, but for today, we are going to have someone that can run with you, because your 9-minute easy pace, yeah, I'm sure it's going to suck to have to like slow down by 2 more minutes, but like for one day, maybe you can do it for 3 miles, right? Like for one day, maybe you can do that for a little bit. So I think that even speaks to a greater thing within the running community and inclusivity in terms of like, truly making sure that no one is left behind. And the way I see it, it's like, oh, wait, if we all really do love this sport, then don't we have, even if it's just like baby, like a little bit of a duty to know what are the running communities, like what are the running groups in our communities, so that if someone says, hey, I'm interested in starting to run, where can I go? We can direct them either towards one group or maybe towards multiple groups, because I think of the example you shared, and I'm curious if after that experience she tried seeking out any other run clubs, or if like that experience was enough for her to be like, let me just take a break and see what comes up. So that's what I'm hearing from what you're saying, or like that's the thought that I'm having, where it's like, oh, so there's something else that if we are looking to make the running community more inclusive, it's what information is shared amongst or within the running community, so that people know where those different access points are, or so that people know where those different subgroups are.
Well, and I think to that point too, the group themselves also needs to just be honest about what the goal is, right? Like if you are, and how big they want to get, right? Like, I think that's actually one thing that I start to think about as we come into, we're at about 9 months of existence, and the amount that we've grown in that time has been huge and also fantastic. And as we get into the summer months, I wonder like how many others will start to get, which is great. On that same token, you have some groups in the area that are just so big that you would think that they would like split off into different like smaller pace groups and things, but it almost just seems certain pace groups like take over more of the running events and things that they coordinate. And so that's a little hard for me to watch that, because that I know, because some of those runners have come to us. I know that detracts, right? That deters people from wanting to stay there if they feel like they're getting lost in the shuffle too. So, as you said earlier, I think it is a good goal to always say, if there is somebody new, then, maybe some of us don't get to do our workout for the day, right? Or somebody takes a step back and says, no, I'm going to like sort of adopt the runner for the day, right? To welcome them into the group. And I think that's a good goal for any club. And then that should be reflected in your messaging that you do on social media. Also, the advertising and how you say what your group and what it is. And I mean, I guess even going backwards, like, do you stand for something too? Like, it doesn't have to get so serious with like a mission statement or philosophy, but I do think there needs to be some thought put into like, what are the values that you want your group to represent, because that's the kind of person that you're going to get then too.
Yeah. And even then, like, I'll challenge you a bit, because I'm like, no, if you're putting this out there as a group that's open to the public, you should be clear with what your values are. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think it's like, oh, maybe.
Okay.
No, I think you should be.
Yeah.
Like, I really do
appreciate
think
that.
there should be some clarity as to that. Yeah, but I'm also like big on values. Like, I'm like, no, we need to know, I need to know what my values are. And I need to be, see, what did I tell you about a working farm? There's a child. Kathy, leave me alone. I'm recording this and your little voice is going to show up in it.
What a cutie.
I knew it. I'm like, there's going to be a human. I could hear her coming. So, all right. I'm like, gosh, okay. I'm like looking at my questions. And again, I want to be mindful of the time. But sure. I did want to ask you, because this one is one that gets me all the time. And there's just so much that has been said that I'm like, obviously we need to talk about some of this stuff a little bit more. But I did want to unpack something with you. The whole, if I don't post my run, it didn't happen mentality.
Okay.
And I just want to understand, maybe from your opinion or from your understanding of like psychology and of group, and like truly, if you have not listened to the belonging episode on For Your Run podcast, you need to go listen to it, because that's what I think of when I think of this. If I don't post my run, it didn't happen. It's like, oh, is that tapping into our sense of belonging? So I'm curious, from your perspective, your opinion, in your experience with all your knowledge, where does this mentality come from? Why do we have it? What purpose does it serve? Because listen, I used to be someone who I would post about my runs all the time. And now I giggle anytime I see a meme about like the run didn't happen because I didn't post it. Cause I'm like, oh yeah. Like I feel like there are times where I have to post on social media, like, hey, I'm still running. Like, just so you all know, I'm still running. And I'm like, but why? Like, why do I even feel that I have to tell people I'm still running? Like, if running is for me, why do I feel like I have to make an announcement about it? So I'm curious. I just wanted to unpack that one in particular, because it's in the ether of social media and running. And I feel like when you first start running, maybe that's something that's a little more prominent or not. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm laughing so much because I have a new favorite. It's not new. I didn't make this up. I just have really appreciated it as of late. It's my favorite joke right now, which is, how do you know that somebody's a runner? Don't worry. They'll tell you.
They'll tell you.
Yeah. Either that or just ask them. Right. And they'll just keep talking about it. But so to that, I think, so there's a couple of things that come to mind for me. One, definitely, I want to amplify what you said about the belonging piece. And especially for people who are new to it, I think that is absolutely one way that I think we feel like we belong within the running community, within a social media aspect. And let's just be honest, getting likes and getting the comments when you do post a run, whether it was good or not, or however you express it, like, it can be validating, right? I mean, like, that's, I would argue, part of the reason we post that stuff is to have other people see it and to then encourage us, right? Like, we reach out for that. Certainly I do. But I think on a deeper level, I'm thinking of a friend of mine who's on her, I think it's 740 something running day streak. And she posts every single run, every single day. And to be honest, I don't know that she does it so much for the validation piece, although certainly that's probably part of it. I think she does it more as a personal record of her achievement. And I think the daily posting, yes, of course, we can do that to seek out from others what we need, but I think it can also be very personal. Like I said earlier, that a lot of times I view my social media as like my personal record, my personal journey, my diary, right? Like, I don't have my bedside journal anymore, but, I think this is it's reincarnated, right? Like, it's a different way of looking at that. And And I think that can be validating in and of ourselves too, right? Like I post the thing, okay, I did a good job, right? Like, or I put that out there. And I think that can help a lot of people process. I think it also holds people accountable, I would imagine, in some way, right? Like if you have people who are consistently following you and consistently liking and commenting on your posts, it's like, if I don't post this one, then I'm being held accountable to the people that are going to encourage me or that are going to push me forward. And also just I think on a more fun level, it's just fun to get feedback too, especially if you know that there's certain people that follow you consistently. Our teammate Maddie, she is like one of the best supporters, and she's always saying something good, and it helps me, right? Like if I'm doing my like flat me pre-race post, she's always going to have something good to say. You, Stephanie, are also one of those people. You always have something good to say, and so I'm going to post that stuff so that I can get that from you guys, because I know you as real people, right? And that's not to say that the people you have never met in real life are not the real people, right? Like they're there to support you still. But I think there's something extra about the people who are consistent for you. And I think that can really help. That can really help a lot.
Yeah, I am laughing because you said the whole like race thing, because there have definitely been moments. I won't say how recent because it'll be embarrassing, but there are definitely moments throughout like my running social media. I have this itch in my throat. Hold on.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem. No problem. I was thinking about this sort of connected to we didn't talk about this specifically. You okay?
I'm good.
Okay. We didn't talk about this question specifically, but I was sort of connected to the keeping up with the Joneses mentality. I know that was on your question list, and I'm sorry that I'm jumping ahead with it, but just the idea of like, oh, well, they posted, so I have to post, or like they did this, so I have to do this too. So there is definitely that aspect there as well. And I think that sort of ties back to the belonging thing too. But at the end of the day, it's also like, how much do you value social media? Some people use it consistently. Some people only post if they've done a race, or some people only if there's a PR, or some people, whatever your value is with that. Which is why I think it just ultimately goes back to that self-awareness. What do you need out of it? What do you want to give to it? And how does it play into your day-to-day outside of the social media too? There's a whole world outside of that also, which sometimes we forget, but there is, and it's, you gotta figure out like what your balance is with that.
Yeah. So I was going to share before the coughing, and I love, first of all, I'm just love all the questions you have posed throughout this. And I'm big on self-awareness. I'm always like, self-awareness is the key to life. However, self-awareness will make life harder because now you can't ignore your own BS, right? Like you can't get around it. Yeah. So I love all the questions because it's all about how self-aware are you? Because it's from that place of self-awareness that you can engage mindfully. If you have no self-awareness, you're just like an empty container taking it all in and not really knowing who you are and who they are. But what I was going to share was that the social media piece, where it's like, again, I won't share how recent I had this most recent experience, but there's like always like this point where I'm like, maybe I should sign up for a race so that I can get more engagement. Like maybe I should do the race so that I can get more exposure for my account. But it's that self-awareness key of like, no, because if I'm doing it for someone else and not for myself. And that's not why, which goes back to like how that question of how much do you value social media, but it also goes to the, like, what is your purpose with social media? Like what's the point of you using this particular platform? Like what is, and it goes back to that again, for me, the question is always why? Like, why am I using this space? Why am I sending this particular message? And why is such an ugly word? Because it can be like, combative. But that's my question is always centered around a why. And so when you bring up the keeping up with the Joneses mentality, that's part of it, of like, wait, but everyone else is posting about races and they're getting a lot of likes and they're getting engagement. And wait, my brain is still, there's still a reptile brain in there that like gets that dopamine hit. It gets that little hit every time there's a like, or every time there's a comment, or when there's even something like, we haven't even touched upon this, right? Like when your content gets reposted by another account, and another account with a larger following, and how social media, like, it does introduce you to other accounts with bigger followings. And as people who, I am sharing my journey, but I'm also a brand of myself, right? Like I also have offerings myself, and it's even like with Skokie, where it's like you are growing this run club. So it's like there is almost that business element of being on social media, of like, yes, part of why I'm here is so that more people can find me. But how do you expand yourself while remaining true to yourself?
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to what we were just saying about having those values. As a run walk club, we have those values. And so that goes back to yourself then too. Like, what is it that, like, what's your purpose of being there? And what is it that you're trying to give to other people? And if you don't, I feel like in some cases, if we don't have an understanding of what is at the core of all of that for yourself, then that's not necessarily the message that you're going to put out there. And, obviously, I'm sure you could guess, but like one of our core values as the Swifters is community. And that drives every single post that I make for the Swifters, or every single thing I try to make it, every single thing that we put out there. And without that, I think it would start to feel a little, wishy-washy or free for all over the place, but it doesn't, because I went into it with that mentality. And I think that's what can happen for some of us in terms of our like personal accounts on social media, is that it might change over time in its goals and what we want to get out of it. Certainly that happened for me. As I mentioned, I started it by being more like teacher focused, but then it certainly has become a running account. Let's just call it what it is. Most of my stuff is running related that I post. But I've tried to reassess like what those values are within that as well. And so if we don't necessarily have that understanding, then maybe what we're putting out there is harder for us to both, I guess, maintain over time, but then also harder for us to understand what we might need from other people. And so again, just going back to that self-awareness piece, it's important to take a step back once in a while, I think. And like, why are you on Instagram? Why are you on Facebook? What's the purpose here? And just making that a regular reflection. I'm not talking about like every day or every week, but just what is it that I'm trying to get out of this? And what am I trying to give to?
Yeah. And it almost sounds very like your social media health. Because I'm hearing you and I'm like, oh, wouldn't that be nice if every 6 months, like you go to the doctor, you go to the dentist, right?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Every 6 months, you kind of do that check-in. And like what I just wrote down, it's this having an openness to reassess what your values are. And I love that, because even reflecting on myself, it's like, oh, when I first started on social media, it was very much like I was doing insanity, right? Like the Beachbody program. And I was like, yeah, insanity. And then I started to run. And then I started sharing more of the yoga stuff. And then I'm having an identity crisis with yoga, but that's a whole different discussion for another day. So like now, if you look at my profile, like maybe you will know that I teach yoga. Most likely you will not, because the content is more on running, because running for me is a safer space to communicate what I'm trying to communicate. Whereas the other things that are a part of me, because I'm still trying to figure out, it's really hard for me to connect and then project.
Sure.
So I love that, like that openness to reassess. And I think there's also this idea that, again, I go back to like that both and instead of either or, right? Like we don't have to be stuck in one way of being, as long as we take that time to reflect on what our values are and to be okay with maybe those values having changed, and to be okay with like, okay, my values have changed and now I'm going to be different. And that's okay, even though it's scary. Again, we come back to like the belonging piece of being a runner. And I mean, I've had that of like, oh my God, but everyone else is still like marathon training. And or they're like excited about the sport in a way that right now I'm not excited about it. And it's hard. It's hard when it's like, there's almost this, when I log on to social media, again, it's that awareness of instead of saying what's wrong with me, that I'm not like everyone else, I'm saying, hey, it's okay to be where you're at.
Yeah. What's
And
right with you? Like that's the question that I wish we could probably, I mean, I certainly wish I would ask myself that more, right? Like what's wrong with me in this race that just happened? And no, but what's right? Like what went well? And I think that's actually an interesting connection back to the psychology piece, where one of the newer fields, although certainly this is now 10, 12 years old, is called positive psychology, where for so long, psychology has looked at what's wrong with people and how do we fix people. And this particular field of psychology does exactly the opposite. It looks at what's right with people, focuses on things like mindfulness, wellness, self-esteem in a way that is not like critical, right? It's looking at things from a different perspective of like, you already have these great things, like how can we improve upon them too? And so I think that goes into that reevaluation piece. And Stephanie, if in a couple of years there is a new job called social media doctor, like we're gonna have to trademark it. Like we should trademark it right now, because certainly
I was gonna say, are you
that's
kidding me?
gonna
I
come
think
up.
we need to put it right now.
Let's get that going, because that is gonna, I mean, already we could use that. I mean, with the way that social media can just honestly be very terrible in some ways, how useful would something like that be, you know, on a personal level, right? Like on a personal level where somebody's trying to help you improve your relationship with it if it becomes a challenge or a problem.
Yeah, in preparation for this, and then this will be my last little bit, and then I'll ask you, because I want to be mindful of the time. I can talk to you forever, but I want to be mindful of the time, because like in preparation for this, like I wrote this whole blog post because I was thinking about it, thinking about my own relationship with social media, how it has evolved, how it is evolving. And what I realized is that it's like a spectrum, right? Like on one end of the spectrum, it's inspire and motivate. And on the other, it's distract and detract. So for me, how I defined it was those accounts that inspire me are the ones that make me want to be my best runner self. Those accounts that motivate me are the ones that make me want to get out the door. Like those accounts where I'm like, yes, I can't wait to go. Like it excites me about running, like doing the actual act itself. And then on the other end of that, there's the detracts are those accounts that take me away from my journey. And then the accounts that distract are the ones, it's the opposite. It's distracts are the ones that take me away from my own running journey. And the detracts are the ones that take away from my running journey. And that's kind of how, like, once I wrote it out, I was like, this makes so much sense to me that it is that. So once I went onto social media and I was like paying attention to the running accounts, I'm like, okay, what is this account doing for me? Is it inspiring me? Is it motivating me? Or is it making me feel worse about myself or less about myself? And that's for me, like, that was my tip. Like, that's my tip when it comes to social media consumption is, I mean, we've shared a bunch of tips, but for me, it was like, okay, really find out, like, is this account one that excites you about the sport, that excites you about your participation in the sport? Or is it one that's making you like, that is making you feel like you're not a part of the sport, or like you shouldn't be a part of the sport, or like where you're like, there's something wrong with where you're at within the sport? And that for me was just like, I was like, oh, now I'm seeing these accounts in a different light. So the question I have for you is, if you can bring it down to one thing, and it can be what you shared with me, or it can be something totally different, as a tip or tool or however you want to call it, for engaging with social media, what would that be for you?
So we briefly went over this a little bit prior to our talk, just via email, but I think it's these set boundaries. And that can be a literal boundary in terms of trying to use the time limit feature that I know iPhones come with. I'm not sure about Androids, but sometimes it doesn't work because you can just click like, oh, ignore time limit for today, which is fine. But at least having that there gives you a reminder of, oh, whatever you set your time limit for, I've been on this for 30 minutes today, probably should take a step back, or an hour, or whatever it is. So there's the literal boundary, but then I think there's also the metaphorical boundary, which is, you just sort of addressed it, right? Like figuring out which things are motivating and inspiring you versus which things are distracting or detracting from you. And I certainly have stopped following certain accounts because they were doing the negative, right? And that was a boundary for me. Like, I understand that this person might be following me, or I understand that this person has commented or liked my stuff before, but I can't continue to have that kind of connection because some of the stuff you're posting it's not working for me, right? And obviously that becomes a very different conversation if that person is like an actual person in your real life day to day, or a friend or a family member. That's a different conversation. But if it is somebody that you're just connecting with through social media, I think it becomes a little bit easier to set that boundary. But ultimately you have to sort of figure out, like, what are your walls and when are you going to put them up, depending on how it's affecting your personal journey too. Thanks.
All right. So on that note, I am going to thank everyone for being here. I'm going to stop the recording. However, the conversation can continue. I just want to be mindful of the time. And for anyone who's watching the replay, also mindful of their time. So if you're watching this on replay, thank you for being here with Sabrina and I. Sabrina, do you have any final words?
Those of you that tuned in after to watch the replay, thank you so much for taking the time. And certainly if you have questions about anything we've talked about today, definitely reach out to us and follow me, Run Teacher Sab, on Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you.